Welcome to our course, English Syntax and Universal Grammar. In this presentation, we are going to discuss four topics. One, we're going to discuss what is linguistics. Two, we're going to give an example of the scientific method using Spanish. Three, we're going to discuss the different areas of linguistics. And four, we're going to discuss the relationship between linguistics and the other sciences. So let's start with what is linguistics. Stop the recording here and provide your own definition of linguistics. When you have your definition, continue with the presentation. We will say that linguistics is the scientific study of language. Linguistics is the scientific study of language. Now, in this definition, we have two very important words. One of them is the word scientific, and the other one is the word language. So what do we mean by scientific, and what do we mean by language? So what do we mean by the scientific method? It means we use the same methodology as in the other sciences. And what is that other methodology? Well, we start with the data, we collect data, then from those data we make a hypothesis. Once we have a hypothesis, we need to provide evidence from our data to support the hypothesis. Then we make predictions. Then we verify the predictions. If the predictions are right, we try to get more data to verify again. If the predictions come out wrong, then we need to revise our hypothesis and start the process all over from number 2 again. So this is what we mean by the scientific method. We follow these steps. We collect the data, we make a hypothesis, we provide evidence to support our hypothesis, we make a prediction or predictions, we verify those predictions, and then we revise the hypothesis if it is necessary to revise. So now we understand what we mean by scientific. Now, what do we mean by language? Linguistics is the scientific study of language. Now, this is a more complicated question. So, what is language? Stop the recording here and try to come up with your own definition of what is language. When you have your definition, continue with the recording. We know a language. What does it mean to say that we know a language? Now, the problem in English is that we only have one word for language. In many languages, we have two words for language. So, to clarify what we mean by language, we need to make a very important distinction between what we're going to call the external language or the e-language, external language, e-language, and what we mean by the internal language or the I language. External language is what we hear, what you can record, what you can collect. Internal language, on the other hand, is going to be the system that we have in our head, and this system, the I language, is going to be what is responsible for producing the E language. So when we say language, notice that we are talking about two kinds of languages. We're talking about the external language or the E language, and we're also talking about the internal language or the I language. In the previous models of generative grammar, the I language was referred to as competence. So competence is the system that allows us to produce language as we use it. And performance is actually what we do with this language. Now, what do we linguists want to do with these two languages? So we said that we have an E language and an I language. Now, what do we linguists want to study as our object of scientific inquiry? Actually, what we want to do is we want to create a model for the I language. So we know that there is a system inside our heads, and what we want to do is to create a model for I language. Science usually tries to model particular elements that we're trying to understand. So in the case of linguists, and in particular theoretical linguistics, what we want to do is to be able to model this I language. Now, how do we create a model for the I language? Remember that the I language is what's in the mind. So we have the E language. Now, the E language is basically the only window that we have into this I language. So what we do then is we use the E language to create a model for the I language. We use the E language to create a model for the I language. Now, how do we create a model? Imagine that we have a calculator. Now, in this calculator, we type 2 plus 2, and the calculator automatically gives us the result of 4. Now, we may think that the calculator knows math because it knows that 2 plus 2 is 4. Now, why does the calculator give us the result of 4? Because the calculator has a program. And where is that program? Well, we open the calculator to see if we can find the program inside. And what are we going to find inside the calculator? We're only going to find cables, connections, chips. We're not going to find a program. So the program is basically a construct that we are going to create. The same happens then when we say a sentence. Let's imagine we say, I love linguistics. Now we know that this is produced and processed in the brain, and I am going to try to see what is happening in the brain when I say I love linguistics. So what happens if I open a brain? Well, I'm going to find all kinds of electrical connections. I'm going to find some gray matter, but I'm not going to find a verb. I'm not going to find a noun phrase. So notice that verbs and noun phrases are constructs. These are terms that we invent to explain phenomena. So how do we create a model then for the I language? Well, we have the external language, and through the external language then we are going to create a model for the I language. I repeat, the E language is going to be our window into the I language. We use the E language to create a model for the I language. What are some of the important differences between the I language and the E language? I language, the internal language versus the external language. Well, the most obvious difference is that the internal language is internal, while the external language is external. Because the E language is external, we can record it, we can collect it, we can put it in a machine and it will give us, phonological results and so on. I language is going to be a construct. It's something that we are proposing that is in our mind, which produces the external language. Another difference between the I language and the E language is that the I language is individual. This means that every individual has his own system. Now, if John speaks English and Mary speaks English, how come they can communicate? Why do we say that they speak the same language? Well, this is because they actually share the same system. If they share the same system, then we assume that they know the same language. Another difference between the I language and the E language is that the I language is finite, while the E language is going to be infinite. What do we mean the E language is infinite? Well, imagine that I say a sentence. I say, for example, I like apples. You can say, oh, I can say a longer sentence than that. You can say, I love apples and oranges. And then another person can say, I love apples, oranges, and bananas. So notice that we can go on and on and on, and we are never going to finish collecting data because our data is going to be infinite. So e-language is actually infinite. However, we have to assume that the I language is finite. Why do we need to assume this? Because if the I language were infinite, a child would never be able to learn a language. Notice that a child learns a language because the child masters the whole system. And you can only master a system if you know all the rules. If you don't know all the rules, you're going to have an imperfect system. So this is why we say that the I language is finite and the E language is infinite. Another difference is that the I language is unconscious. You don't know why you know something. If you say, for example, Mary speaks English, why do we put an S there? Well, if you're a native speaker, you know that automatically. And you know that because that's what you learned, that's what you heard when you were learning the language. Now, if you are a second language speaker, you learned English as a foreign language, then notice that you know that because you were taught that rule. You were taught that you need to say Mary speaks English. If you don't put that S, this is wrong. Now, why does the native speaker do this unconsciously? The speaker automatically will put that S there. The speaker doesn't know. Notice that if we go to the doctor and the doctor tries to find, let's say, a hidden reason for why the speaker does this, the doctor is not going to find that. This is because the system is unconscious. Finally, there's a very important difference between the I language and the E language. The I language is intentional while the E language is extensional. So intentional, I language is intentional, I with I, and the external language is extensional, E with E, intentional, extensional. Now, we need to explain a little bit more what we mean by intentional and extensional. We will do that in the next slide. We say that e-language is extensional. Extensional, notice, comes from the word extension. And what do we mean by extension? So imagine, for example, that I say, okay, this is my system. My system produces 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. This is the extension. So the extension is going to be the collection of all the individual items that I have in a set. So 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. This is the extension. Now, in this particular case, what is the intention? The intention is going to be the formula, the system that creates this extension. So in this case, notice that if you take a number, and you multiply that by 2, you get the extension. So 1 multiplied by 2 gives you 2, 2 times 2 gives you 4, 3 times 2 gives you 6, and so on. Notice then that the formula then seems to be you take any positive number and you multiply that number by 2, then you get the extension. So here we have the intension and the extension. The extension is going to be the collection of results, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. However, the intension is going to be the system, the formula that is going to give us that extension. So we say that the I language is intentional. In other words, the I language is going to contain the formulas, but the extension, so this is going to be what we're going to hear in the E language. So the I language is intentional. It will have all these formulas, and the extension is going to be then what we hear when we hear the E language. So now we're ready to then answer the question of what is linguistics. We said that linguistics is the scientific study of I language. We understand what we mean by scientific, and we understand what we mean by I language. Now remember that the way that we're going to study I language is we're going to use the E language as our window to the I language, but our main objective is going to be to create a model for that I language. And this is what we're going to be doing in this course. We're going to be looking at E language, in this case English and Vietnamese, and we're going to be creating a system. We're going to create a model for what we think is going to be in our mind. Of course, this model can be right or it could be wrong. That is science. So, our goal as linguists is to create a scientific model of I language, and we use the E language to create that model. Now, the E language we collect, we can record, we can write down, and so on. Okay, now we're going to apply the scientific method to some Spanish verbs. Let's take two verbs, the verb cantar, which means to sing, and the verb saltar, which means to jump. Here we have the paradigm. The paradigm is going to be the different forms for the singular. So repeat after me. Canto, cantas, canta. That's for cantar. I am saying I sing, you sing, he sings. Now let's do to jump. Saltar, salto, saltas, salta. I jump, you jump, he jumps. Now these are the forms. Now stop the recording here and see if you can find the system. What is the system that allows us to generate all these forms? Stop the recording, and when you have a hypothesis, come back to the recording. So what we're trying to do here is basically find the system that is going to allow us to generate all these forms. Now notice that, let's take the verb cantar for example. We can see that there are two parts in all these forms. There's one part that we call the stem, and in this case the stem is going to be cant. And how do we get the stem? We go to the infinitive and we take out the ending for the infinitive, which is going to be AR, and that's how we get the stem. Now to that stem we add some endings, and this is what we call the personal endings. So we will add O for the first person, we add as for the second person, and we add a for the third person, and that's how we get canto, cantas, cantas. Similarly for saltar, we will get salto, saltas, salta. So we take the stem and we add these endings that we might call personal endings. Now, how can we test the hypothesis? So basically what we said is that we have a stem, and to the stem we add o as a. Let's take two verbs. Let's take the verb pagar, which means to pay, and amar, which means to love. Now, what are the forms that our rule is predicting? Stop the recording here and you generate the forms, and then we will see if you're right or you're wrong. The forms that we predict are here: pago, pagas, paga, and amo, amas, ama. So notice we take the stem. We said that the stem is going to be the form without the infinitive ending, which is ar, and we add o as a. So we get pago, pagas, paga, amo, amas, ama. So in this case, we are happy because our hypothesis seems to work. Now, of course, the more data you analyze, the better. So we will move on and try to analyze or test more data. So here's our hypothesis. We said that we take the stem and we add o as a, and we're going to take two verbs. We're going to take the verb pagar, to pay, and comer, and we're going to see if this works. Now, when we check with the native speaker gives us these results: pago, pagas, paga. Now, in this case, the hypothesis seems to work. We get the correct forms. But notice that in the case of comer, we are getting the wrong forms because the speaker would say como, comes, come. It doesn't say como, comas, coma. So we are getting the wrong result in this case. Now, we need to explain what's happening. So what we observe here is that in the case of pagar, the infinitive ends in ar, but in the case of comer, the infinitive ends in er. So what we might say is that we actually have two classes of verbs, and then we need to have a different kind of rule for our example like comer. So notice that in this case, we conclude that our hypothesis needs revision. And of course, we need to revise the hypothesis and then test more data. So here we have seen how the scientific method works. We had some data. From those data, we came up with a rule or a hypothesis. Then we tested the hypothesis and we saw that the hypothesis worked in some cases. So in that case, we were happy. And we saw that sometimes it does not work. So if it does not work, then notice that it's a little bit more complicated and we need to revise the hypothesis. That's how the scientific method works, and this is how we're going to proceed in this class. Now that we know what we mean then by the scientific method and what we mean by linguistics, let's look at the different areas of linguistics. We will say that linguistics has two main areas. One area is going to be what we call core linguistics, and the other area is going to be what we call applied linguistics. So now we're going to try to define each of these areas. Let's start with core linguistics. What do we mean by core linguistics? Basically, core means is going to be the heart of linguistics. And when we look at the heart of linguistics, we really have three aspects of language that we look at. We have sound, we have form, and we have meaning. Now, within linguistics, we have different areas of linguistics that study these particular aspects. Now, in the case of sound, we have phonetics. Phonetics is going to be the area of linguistics that studies the production of sounds. Then we have phonology. Phonology is going to be the area of linguistics that studies the processes that are related to those sounds. When we look at form, we have morphology. Morphology concerns itself with words and word formation. And then we have syntax, and this is basically once we have the words, then we put those words in order, and those words in order is what gives us a sentence. So syntax is basically the study of sentences. Once we have a sentence, the sentence then will have meaning, and this is what we call semantics. So semantics is going to be the meaning of sentences. Now, the meaning of a sentence can change depending on the context. And this is then what pragmatics is going to study. We're going to look at some examples later. And these are then the 6 fields of linguistics that are concerned with core linguistics: phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Normally, these are the areas that you study when you take a course like Introduction to Linguistics. You start with core linguistics. Now, why would you start with core linguistics? You start with core linguistics because this is going to be the heart of linguistics. If you want to be a good linguist and you decide not to be a theoretician, you have to understand these 6 areas very well in order to be a good linguist. So this is what we mean then by core linguistics. It's going to be the heart of linguistics. Then we have applied linguistics. Now, applied linguistics has many, many areas. One of them is going to be learning a language. And it can be a field where you study the acquisition of learning language 1, language 2, or even a language 3. The study of acquisition of language 3 is a very important field of research these days. And the area of linguistics that is going to do this is going to be language acquisition, sometimes also understood as psycholinguistics, although psycholinguistics is more concerned with the processes rather than the acquisition itself. Then we have language and brain, and language and mind, and this is neurolinguistics. This is the linguistics of the future. Once we understand how the brain works and what is the connection between brain and mind, this is going to be neurolinguistics. Then we have language and computers. We know that the mind is a super powerful computer. So we use computers to understand how the mind works, and this is what computational linguistics does. Basically, they try to test different programs and then see whether these programs can actually generate the e-language as we generate it. Then we have language and society. This is how language is used in society, and this is sociolinguistics. So here, for example, we can study do women speak differently from men, for example? Do younger people speak differently from older people? Um, this is going to be then questions that sociolinguistics is going to try to answer. Then we have dialects and language variation. Now, this is also part of sociolinguistics, but there's one more specific area of linguistics that deals with that, and this is what we call dialectology. These days, dialectology has really become part of sociolinguistics. So if you study different varieties of, let's say, English, then you're really also studying sociolinguistics. There's another field that is growing in importance, and this is language and the law. And this is what we call forensic linguistics. So forensic linguistics relates to language and the law. So for example, someone is accused of violating a contract. Now, to be sure that this is the case, they might hire a linguist to decide whether that's exactly what the language in the contract said or not. So that would be language and the law. Then we have history of language, and this is what we call historical linguistics. This tells you how language changes through time. This is also sometimes called diachronic linguistics. Diachronic. Diachronic means dia through chronic time. So linguistics through the times, uh, as opposed to modern linguistics. Modern linguistics is what we call synchronic linguistics. Syn means together, chronic, time. So together in the time, that means modern, nowadays. So let's summarize a little bit. What is the big picture? So we said that linguistics then has two main areas. One is what we call core linguistics, and within core linguistics we saw that we had six different fields, uh, starting with production of sounds, phonetics, phenomena associated with those sounds, that's phonology. You put those sounds together into words, and that's what morphology studies. You put those words together and you get sentences. This is what syntax studies. You get sentences. Sentences have meaning. This is what semantics studies. And then that meaning in different contexts can change, and that is what pragmatics is going to study. That's core linguistics, six different fields: phonetics, phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. And then we said that we also have applied linguistics. Now, why do we call it applied linguistics? And we saw that we have many different fields within applied linguistics. Basically, because whatever field you pick in applied linguistics, you're always going to be applying one of these core fields. So, for example, you are going to study acquisition. Well, acquisition of what? You're going to study the acquisition of sounds. You're going to study the acquisition of words. You're going to study the acquisition of meaning. So notice that you're always going to be studying an acquisition of a core area of linguistics. This is why we call this applied linguistics. Let's look at the connection between linguistics and the other sciences. Let's have this red area here represent linguistics. Linguistics is part of what science? What do you think? Linguistics is part of psychology. Psychology, as the name suggests, logi comes from logos, which means the study. Psycho comes from psyche. In Greek means uh, the mind, the spirit. So in this case, notice that because linguistics is interested in the study of language, which is part of mind, we say then that linguistics is part of psychology. Now, psychology is part of another science. Can you guess what that science is? That science is biology. Again, biology, logi comes from logos, the study, and bio comes from bios, which in Greek means life. So the study of life, that's biology. Now, humans are part of life, biology. Humans have a mind, so that's what psychology studies. And psychology then is part of linguistics because we are interested in language, which is part of the mind. Finally, biology is part of another bigger science, and that science is physics. Physics is the mother of all the sciences. So here we can see then why we say that linguistics is the scientific study of language. Linguistics is part of science. Linguistics is a science, is part of physics, and when we uh, do our experiments, when we make our hypothesis, we are following the scientific method because we are part of the sciences.